Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Future in Review podcast. I'm here today with Sir Richard Dearlove, who is the former Chief of British Intelligence at MI6. We are going to be talking about the state of geopolitics, specifically the CRINK alliance, that is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and how it is driving international conflict. And we're also going to be taking you beyond the headlines to help you understand what is at play internationally, how these countries are working together to drive what, Sir Richard, I believe that you have referred to as a gray war. And just generally help people understand what's going on in the world. There's a lot happening every day, and I think there's generally a feeling of overwhelm that I've seen amongst people.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Berit, and it's really nice to be given the opportunity to do some geopolitical analysis and explanation, because at the moment we are living in a complicated international environment where, let's say, the international security situation, what I would describe probably in the post-war world as Pax Americana, has largely broken down and nothing yet has replaced it. So there's a sort of fluidity and almost what one consider continuous crisis in world events, and largely driven, I believe, by the autocratic regimes that you have described with the acronym CRINK. And obviously the two most serious problems we face, I think in the medium to long term, China is the bigger problem. But of course, if you're sitting here in Europe, the war in Ukraine, the behavior of Russia is also extremely worrying. And although I would consider Russia a power in significant decline, as it's going down, it's a great force of destabilization. China is the opposite, as a power going up. It's also a force for destabilization as it flexes its muscles regionally and globally. And of course, on top of that, now we have the crisis in the Middle East, which, in my view, is entirely driven by the Iranians.
So I want to come back to that in a minute, but let's start off by talking a little bit about the players in this space. You've described China and Russia specifically as being the two biggest threats. In my opinion, one of the things that people don't take seriously enough is the significance of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea all working together and the different roles that they play in that alliance. Because, to your point, as China has risen in power, they have tended to be taken a little bit more seriously, but the capability of the four of them kind of playing different roles in this alliance is what really makes it, to my mind, most alarming. Do you agree with that?
I do, but it's an alliance of convenience.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't necessarily an alliance of common interest. And they are allies. To an extent, they do work together. But there are also quite significant problems within that grouping. Okay. If you take the relationship between China and North Korea, I think China's fear is that the destabilization of North Korea would be a massive problem for China. I'm probably one of the few people who've actually sat down with the Chinese leadership a long time ago, admittedly, and discussed North Korea. They have a fear of, let's say, North Korea destabilizing it. And it would be a massive problem because the population of North Korea would cross the border into China and there would be nothing that the Chinese could do to stop it. So, I mean, China's attitude towards North Korea is to live with North Korea and to keep North Korea afloat. But of course, it is such a peculiar regime, North Korea. I mean, I would describe it as a completely autistic nation. But on the other hand, I mean that it conducts its international relations from a point of view globally, which is unique, which doesn't sort of comprehend the international security situation, and therefore it's made itself rather extraordinarily, into a potential nuclear power. which of course does create, let's say, a cordon of deterrence around it. The expense of doing something about North Korea, would be very costly internationally. And it is a side player. It's a bit player, but it could be massively important as a destabilizing force
Right.
in
That's
the
kind of
Far
the
East.
role that I see North
Sorry?
Korea playing.
Yeah.
That is the role that I see North Korea playing in international relations, is that they can act as this rogue state in a way where people are generally like, well, it's just North Korea, they just do that stuff.
No,
But
no, well,
actually,
hang on a moment. They've got a serious nuclear program.
yeah,
And although it is not what you and I would understand to be a weapons flight tested program, it probably works. And what I mean by that is, it's composite missile technology, which is based on the sort of what's called Taipei-dong missile, and then the number of warheads. It could probably fire a warhead which would reach the Pacific coast of North America. It's not very good
right.
at targeting, but it doesn't need to be if it's got a nuclear
Mhm.
weapon. So, this is problematic. And, we were aware, I'm not, in the know any longer. It was producing fissile material, and it had enough fissile material to make a certain number of weapons. And it potentially has a delivery system which is originally derived from Chinese missile technology, which it has sort of developed on its own accord. So it's a very prickly, troublesome player. Of course,
Yeah.
it's not economically important at all, because the regime is in such dire straits, financially and economically. But that in a way that doesn't matter. And the Chinese could have done something about the problem, but for the reasons I've already described, they decided not to. And they, as it were, contain it, keep an eye on it, and are not unfriendly towards North Korea. And everybody ought to go to the NDZ, the zone between North and South Korea. It's the last Cold War armistice line. It's quite a scary experience to go there and to see what it's actually like. And if you look across the border, these are there are Potemkin villages built to make it look as though it's a developed country, you know,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
there's the
Kind of like the
largest
tours
flag
that
pole
they
in the
take people
world.
on.
Sorry?
I said it's a bit like the tours that they take people on who come to visit, where they bring them into these perfectly manicured
Yeah,
spaces, and meanwhile everyone around them is hungry and
yeah. I mean,
suffering.
North Korea, it's pretty catastrophic. It is catastrophic, and the regime is bizarre in its behaviour, as we all know, and there are many examples of that. But in terms of the geopolitics of the regimes we're talking about, it is in a way the least important.
Okay,
Um,
so let's talk about Iran. What role
well,
does Iran play in this group?
Iran. Well, I think you have to look at Iran in the context of the division in the Middle East between Sunni and Shia Islam.
Hmm.
There are over a billion Sunnis. I think it's 1.4 billion. I can't remember the exact figure. And there are about 400 million Shia. Iran really represents the leadership of the Shia world. And these two versions of Islam, it's the Middle East's wars of religion which plagued Europe between Catholic and Protestant in the 17th, 16th, and 17th, mainly the 17th century. And this is a vicious war which ebbs and flows, and Iran plays an important role. It is deeply hostile towards the leading Arab states, and of course, it is publicly devoted, to the destruction of the state of Israel. And the latest events, I think, are best described as Iran wanting to take the initiative in destabilizing the Middle East and making sure that the Abraham Accords, which were advancing rather fast and rather successfully, were, thrown back into chaos. And the Abraham Accords were sort of stopped in their track. Saudi Arabia was pretty close to opening diplomatic relations with the State of Israel.
Right.
What you also have to look at is that Iran itself is in a parlous state. And what I mean by that, it has a succession problem. There's no obvious successor to the supreme leader who's in his late 80s. No one's quite sure how old he is, and who may also be in quite fragile health. We're not sure. In addition, in addition to that, we know that the population, the highly educated, highly literate population of Iran, which also distinguishes it amongst some Middle Eastern countries, does not like its regime, and there are serious internal problems. The political situation is extremely brittle, but the Praetorian Guard, which is the IRGC, are very effective at repression. The repression is extremely brutal, and a lot of Iranians prefer to sit tight and not challenge the regime and risk their lives by doing so. So you have this tremendous sort of destabilization of progress in the Middle East towards, what would have been, the basis of perhaps an agreement with Israel. And I think, in my own view, the IRGC are entirely behind the Hamas uprising and invasion of Israel. And what Iran has done, and it has become very sophisticated and clever at doing it, is fighting arm's length conflict through proxies. And the Quds Force, part of the IRGC, is the agency for carrying that out. And you will remember the previous head of it, Qasem Soleimani, was killed by an American drone strike in 2016, was it, or 2017? And I think what Iran has decided is to sacrifice Hamas in order to achieve this strategic destabilization. What's interesting is that the more important of the two proxy forces is Hezbollah, and there is a clear reluctance on the Iranian part at the moment to sort of escalate the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. There's always a tension across the northern border. There are exchanges of artillery and rockets, but they're not actually constantly fighting. And my view is that Iran is preserving Hezbollah, which is a strategic buffer between Israel and Iran. And then there's a third group, the Houthi in Yemen, who are much more uncontrollable, but they're still armed by the IRGC, and they're not a glove puppet in the way that Hamas is, but they may be 60% controlled by Iran. And Iran has, as we know, in Ukraine, built up a drone capability, a missile capability, and of course it has its own nuclear program. The question is, how much fissile material has it actually got? I don't know the answer to that question any longer. And how quickly could it weaponize? Probably, within a year it could weaponize. My sort of informed guess from previous knowledge would be weaponization is not far away, and most of all of its nuclear weapons facilities now, like its enrichment equipment and all of that, is probably under hard cover in hollowed out mountains and that sort of thing, so difficult to attack. So I mean that, and then of course Iran maintains this strange relationship with Russia, where there's a strategic relationship, and has supplied Russia with drones, which are unsophisticated technologically, but quite effective. And of course, with its embargoed oil, which is fundamental to its economy, which is in a parlous state as well. I mean, the economy. I was talking to someone the other day. The 800% inflation annually. I question that figure, but that's what I was told. Iran is selling most of its embargoed oil cheap to China, so it's a great deal for Chinese industry, because it's getting its oil from Iran at less than $60 a barrel.
China's getting a lot of cheap oil right now, it would seem.
Absolutely, yeah. Cheap oil, cheap gas. Cheap oil and gas from Russia, and cheap oil and gas, well, mainly oil from Iran.
So, just today, Janet Yellen announced that the U.S. is going to be imposing, or the Treasury Department is going to be imposing sanctions on Iran's drone industry.
Yeah.
How well do you think that will actually work?
Good question. The Europeans have announced the same, and I'm not sure the extent to which any of the bits in the drones are actually coming from Western markets. And if they are coming from Western markets, they're coming anyway illegally. I mean, in a way, it's almost a symbolic move, which should already exist, because the current sanctions should already be making it damn difficult for the Iranians to manufacture their drones. So I don't, I'd have to look into that with a bit more expert analysis to help me to understand why that's been necessary. It's somewhat surprising, because it should be sanctioned already.
I mean, it seems also, based on what we've seen from the sanctions on Russia, that move at that point was then to just turn around and sell everything to China, who then sells it back to the rest of the world at a higher price. So I'm just curious if you see any utility or, I mean, what would it take to have a kind of comprehensive sanction package that would actually have the intended impact?
It makes life difficult, because it closes off the sort of normal channels of commerce and makes it impossible for those to be used by Iran, by Russia. It makes life very difficult. So it does have a profound effect on the economy. But the idea that you can sort of slap an embargo or a sanction on and completely sort of close the economy down, it just doesn't work like that, because the complexity of closing off the Straits of Hormuz, for example, where you couldn't do that for obvious reasons. So sanctions are partly symbolic in terms of a political gesture, but they do, in the long term, make a huge difference to the economy. And certainly, if you look at Iran's economic situation, it is pretty dire. I mean, really dire, actually. And that makes life very difficult. And it certainly makes life difficult for the average Iranian, who can't, love the regime greatly, because it's the population that suffers more than the elite, of course.
Yeah. So let's talk about China. We've discussed a lot of these different actors, but what, in your opinion, is China's long-term strategy as the most threatening of this group? In your words, what is their goal? and
That's
how are
simply
they
that is simply stated, because if you read the documentation for the 20th Party Congress, it says in words of one syllable, the West doesn't like to recognize this, that China's objective is global domination by 2049. I, you
I
can't
know
put
they're
more.
you have to give it to them because they're very clear about what their goals are. It's just that no
Yeah,
one. It's amazing to me they keep putting out these giant papers and announcements of like how they're building up their here's their strategy. It's written right there, but most Western media doesn't seem to be picking up on it, right? Which is
well,
part of why we're having this
it's
this
changing.
conversation today.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I think SNS has done a great job in being one of the first. I think you and I mean, SNS and myself, I've been a massive critic of the West's policy towards China, particularly here in the UK. I was totally fed up with David Cameron and George Osborne when they were, the two leading figures in the government who were cozying up to China. We were going to have a special relationship with China. I mean, it was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And actually, now we've got Cameron back as our foreign secretary, which I think is a mistake. Someone who was closely associated privately with China and Chinese finance, global finance, when he, stepped down from politics, and he's come back as foreign secretary. My God, it's ridiculous. Anyway, my comment when he was appointed was, I'm better qualified than he is to be foreign secretary. um, and I'm not, I'm old enough and outspoken enough now not to care about criticizing senior politicians. Maybe he's learned his lesson and changed his mind. I hope he has. But he didn't listen to people like me when we were shouting from the sidelines. And actually, we did have one big achievement. We stopped our 5G development being placed in the hands of a Chinese company, Huawei.
Huawei, yeah, yeah.
And we did stop that. And that was through extensive lobbying and, of course, pressure from the United States and Australia, who had already taken those steps. And in the end, the UK, thank God, changed its mind just about in time. But look, I mean, the situation with China is complicated because we're not sort of returning to a Cold War, but we have a situation where our economies with China intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
The US economy is intertwined. The European economy is, certainly the German economy specifically, very hooked up. The UK quite significantly, but not to the same degree. So, and during the Cold War, there was this isolation between the Warsaw Pact countries and the West. I mean, there were points of overlap, like the sale of grain into the Soviet market. But there were not these sort of complex connections and entwinement that you have now. So, I mean, I'm not preaching disentanglement. What I'm preaching is eyes open in our relations with China. And I did a podcast with Mike Pompeo, who I admire as the former head of CIA, as you'll recall. And Mike said to me on that podcast, I said, what's the basis that you would advise for dealing with China? And he said, Richard, reciprocity. Treat them exactly like they
Right,
treat
right.
us.
That
And
is the thing that I watch the United States not doing right
yeah,
now that
that's,
drives me
yeah,
crazy. Like
yeah,
there's such a breakdown between what the perception is of what China is doing and the
yeah,
way that they are approached by US
yeah,
politicians.
sure.
And
It should, it should be absolutely ruthless reciprocity. Look, the
yeah.
Chinese do not accept win-win. They only accept we win, you lose. And they play that over a long period of time. So they make it look at the beginning as though it might be win-win, but you can
Right.
definitely know that it's not going to be.
That's
It's
not the plan at the end of the day.
no, that is never the plan at the end. And the Chinese, because they're totally autocratic, have the ability to structure their policy long term in a way
Mm-hmm.
that is much more difficult for, democratic countries. So the Chinese can play this longer term game. And they do, they think things through very carefully. And, they prepare and, they choreograph all their moves. You've read Chinese policy papers. I've read Chinese policy papers. What's fascinating about them is the degree of calculation that you
They're very
see in
specific
the.
about what it is
Yeah,
that they're doing. And
yeah,
they,
sure.
it's interesting is actually China is interesting because they telegraph, so as we were saying earlier, so carefully exactly which sectors they're going after, kind of what their approach is, what the strategy
Yeah, they
is.
tell you.
And then they
But I mean,
build
no one takes any notice because
no,
it's too boring and too difficult to read. It is boring and difficult to read, but you have to talk to people. I mean, there are two or three commentators here in the UK who are brilliant on this. They are former diplomats who've spent tons of time in Beijing, who speak fluent Chinese, who speak fluent Mandarin,
mm,
and they really know what they're talking about. And they read the documentation carefully, 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 and they'll give you this interpretation. I think people. I mean, Trump did one. Well, he did several good things, but the Trump administration got China right. And I mean, what's extraordinary is that Trump forced the West into rethinking its China policy, and I regard that as a significant step forward. And look at it, look how it's playing out now. Look what the Chinese are doing in the Philippines. Whatever it is that they're constantly harassing and pushing. They're
right.
constantly, fortifying another reef. They're pushing down towards what it is, the second Thompson Reef off the north of the Philippines, and giving the Filipinos a really hard time. I mean, they just don't stop, and it. And you've got this election now in the Solomon Islands, or this referendum in the Solomon Islands on actually, whether the Solomon Islands should have closer links with Beijing, and they're buying the Solomon Islands, for God's sake.
Right. So let's talk about that because this is something that they're doing not just in the South China Sea, but all throughout Africa and South
Yeah,
America as well.
yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what you have seen happening in Africa and South America? Like, what is the
Well,
next iteration of Belt and Road Initiative, and what is the impact that it's having on those two continents?
I mean, Belt and Road now is quite mature, and it's not quite as successful as it was at the beginning. And bear in mind the pattern that has been created with Belt and Road is the Chinese have used it to
Infrastructure.
secure supply to commodities.
Hmm.
And then over and above that, you've seen them indebting various countries
Right.
so that they fall to an extent. It's almost a type of colonization uh, where the countries become so tied to a Chinese model, tied to Chinese credit, that it's hard to escape that trap. But I think a lot of African nations are waking up to the downside and the problem. I think some of the South American nations are doing the same. And it's typical of the Chinese, in Belt and Road. They come in, develop a copper mine. They don't use local labor. They bring in their own workers. So the local benefit is highly questionable. And
And the local debt, it turns out, afterwards is very high.
yeah, and and one's
Mhm.
seen this happen all over the place. And of course,
Yeah.
there are certain countries in which their presence now is, I mean, like Burma, where they've got access to deep water ports on the Indian Ocean, and their sort of control of the ghastly military regime in Burma, or the extent to which it's beholden to China. In Sri Lanka, they helped the government basically uh, win the civil war and defeat the Tamil tigers, and that was a bloody war. Both sides absolutely ruthless, but the Chinese played a huge role. They now have a massive deep water port, which they built in southern part of Sri Lanka. And then Pakistan is the other example. And there are and yet at the same time, Mr. Schultz is in Beijing for 3 or 4 days, with a massive
Mr. Schultz,
delegation.
you mean Howard?
No, I mean the German
Oh,
Chancellor.
I see. Yes, the
Schultz,
German Prime
the
Minister.
German Chancellor, is there with a huge business delegation from Germany, because the Chinese market is so important to particularly German automotive industry. And you've got two European countries. You've got Italy and Germany. So the EU has no unified policy on how to deal with China, because two of the major players in Europe call their own shots, which Brussels, doesn't necessarily agree with. No, China's a problem, and then they're becoming they're becoming militarily aggressive and expansive in the South China Sea with regard to Taiwan. Their intelligence activity has been transformed over the last decade. There's been there've been a lot of incidents in the States, which the FBI have publicized. There's been a lot of problems in the UK, which have been publicized. This is a different type of Chinese intelligence from how it used to operate. It was very much below the radar.
Yeah, let's talk more about that. When you say it's a different type of Chinese intelligence, what does that mean? What are they doing now that they
Well,
weren't?
I mean, they didn't do much spying in the past. I mean, if you go way back, there's more sort of classic. I mean, their technique was, if you go back to sort of Zhou Enlai and the origins of Chinese intelligence, it was very much sort of make friends for China, and it was very much oriented around sort of seducing businessmen into relationships where they would benefit the Chinese economy, the development of the Chinese economy. And they saw, the theft of intellectual property, which was done mainly commercially, as essential to accelerated development of the Chinese economy. So the two organizations, the Ministry of State Security and the Second People's Liberation Army, which is the military, of those two, 2PLA was by far the more influential organization outside China and very active. Now that they've become more aggressive, less risk averse.
Yeah.
And, they've been willing to sort of interfere politically in a way which I think they would have been cautious about 15 or 20 years ago. So you've had some very clear examples of them interfering in politics in Australia.
Canadian election. Yeah.
Well, I mean, all over the place. And,
Yeah.
there was a lady running around here in London, who was, a Hong Kong-based solicitor who basically was working for the International Front Department of the Chinese Communist Party, buying, the engagement of British politicians and MPs. I got called out by the security service. And then, of course, there's the whole technical issue, which I've been quite aggressive and loud about, of the Internet of Things. Cellular modules, which are being placed particularly in Chinese manufactured cars, and I'm not sure whether you're aware of it, but a government car, no one will say whose car it was, but it was a senior member of the government, was recently dismantled by the security service, and through the cellular module,
this was in the UK or in the US?
It was in the UK.
Okay.
The car was the conversations in the back of the car were being eavesdropped.
Right. And by the way, EVs at the moment are a central Chinese economic export.
I know.
In.
And if you buy a Chinese vehicle, it's connected to the internet.
Right. It's essentially a giant listening device.
The software can be updated through the internet without you knowing about it. The car can be immobilized. I mean, how many cars would it take to immobilize New York? 50 electric cars? You could completely immobilize New York, but any American city, any British city. And there's, okay, the Chinese say, oh, we would never do that. That's rubbish. Because, under Chinese security law, any industry is obliged to do what the government
Whatever
says.
China.
And what
Right.
people forget about China is it's a communist leadership. The Communist Party run China, and it's a more developed version of communism than the Soviet Union had, because
Right.
their ability using technology to control the population. I mean, we use technology in the West to empower the population, if you see what I mean. In China, it's used as an instrument of control. I mean,
You're speaking
okay,
about
that's a very simple statement, but you
yeah,
understand.
yeah, yes. Yeah, so and here's one example of that I've seen, which is China now has a global repository of intelligence about U.S. citizens, journalists, politicians that they rely on. So I want to talk to you about, and I'm sure that's true of the UK as well.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure.
I want to talk to you a little bit about TikTok. This is a
Yeah,
big deal right now in the United States because TikTok is the largest social network
sure.
owned by ByteDance, which is, a Chinese
Yeah,
company which operates under the same reality as every other Chinese company, which is at any point that the Chinese Communist Party says, do this thing for me, they have to do this thing for them, right?
yeah.
And so I guess my question for you is have you seen direct evidence of a lot of the times when I talk about this, the feedback that I hear from people, many of whom are TikTok users and have made a lot of money on TikTok and don't want to actually get rid of TikTok, their feedback is, well, there's no evidence. And so my question for you is, have you seen evidence that TikTok is being used as a tool of propaganda by the Chinese Communist Party?
Not directly, but I'm not a TikTok. I'm familiar with the issue, and I know a lot about it.
Mhm.
But have I? No. But you don't. I mean, that's such. The question is naive in a way, because the Chinese will use. It's like stocking your bank. For the
Right.
moment when you need the resources, and there will come up. I mean, how do you think that China is going to dominate the globe by 2049? It's going to unleash, its full capability once it's stored and stocked all this. Data is the new oil, if you see what I mean. I mean, control of data is what the Chinese are aiming towards.
Looking for.
They're
Yeah.
creating a world where, they will have massive power, which goes right down to the individual level. I mean, if you're a citizen in China now, I can't remember the technical word for it, but the state keeps a file on you. And I mean, every single Chinese, and and you have a scoring system whereby you're a good
Hmm.
citizen or a bad citizen, and that
Right.
is
It's called
being,
Sesame Credit.
yeah. And um, I mean, you don't need an example, because we know the Chinese are doing it. Why the hell are they doing it? Because one day they're going to need it.
I agree with you. I agree with you very much. But I felt obliged to ask you that question as a security
I know,
professional.
I know, but people need to listen to people like me. Okay, I'm getting a bit long in the tooth, but I'm still a sort of commentator on these issues, and I do
Mhm.
sort of understand the way this works. And it's a massive problem. It's a massive problem, and particularly for our youth, as it were, who are sort of
Mhm.
incontinent with regard to social media, and they do not understand the risks they're running.
I think, one of the ways that I see it being used and have seen evidence of it being used, like there are lists of, well, for example, just this week, there was a former TikTok uh, employee who came out saying that, like, oh, yeah, this supposed separation between church and state was really cosmetic, right? Which,
Yeah,
shocker. I think we could have all seen that coming. But I've also seen lists of banned words, right? Which include things like which include terms that would be demoted on TikTok. So things like terms like Uyghur or
Yeah,
Xinjiang or
yeah,
all of these things. I think that's
yeah,
one way that people don't realize. Like, if you're using TikTok as your primary source of information, there's a lot that you're not going to see on a regular
yeah,
basis because it doesn't fit with the uh, view or the world view that the Chinese Communist Party would want TikTok and
yeah, sure.
ByteDance
And
forward.
Xi Jinping is trying to control the access of Chinese young people to
Right.
social
They don't
media.
have it in
I
in
know.
China.
Well, I
It's
mean,
very interesting.
yeah. And why won't the Chinese will not allow Tesla cars near
Mm-mm.
sensitive government sites in
Right.
China? Why?
Right.
It's
Same reason.
obvious.
Yeah,
Same
because
reason.
they're yeah. So there's a new House bill out. They've just in the U.S. they've just combined the potential TikTok ban. I found this very ironic
Yeah.
with the defense bill, the defense spending bill, making it very likely that it will pass. However, the rider to this has also extended the length of time in which ByteDance would be forced to sell TikTok
Yeah.
to 6 months, which incidentally is just past the end of the United States election.
God, crazy. Well,
So
I mean,
that was a move that I thought was interesting.
yeah. No, it's really essential that these companies are not in Chinese control. It's as simple as that.
Are there other companies that you're aware of that you believe should not be in Chinese control, or that you're
Well,
worried may be under
I think
Chinese?
I can't remember but the names of the companies that are manufacturing cellular modules which are going
Mm-hmm.
into the Internet of Things, that should be very carefully controlled because, I mean, it may sound a bit like science fiction, but you don't want to buy a fridge which is connected, to the internet, which modern fridges will be, tell you what's in there, how long, all the stuff but that similarly will be a source of data for the Chinese state. And you can't separate, state and business.
If you could wave a magic wand tomorrow and put a new set of policies, Western policies in place as it relates to China, what would they be?
Wow, that's a tough question. I'm not sure I can answer it. Well, I'd chuck China out of the World Trade Organization for starters.
Okay.
Um, so, and I would make everything absolutely strictly reciprocal. I wouldn't be there to sort of, destroy the relationship with China, but I think, the Chinese need to be absolutely clear in their view that we'll treat them exactly like they treat us. And in every respect. And what that means is, Chinese citizens would not be free to travel around the United States because we're not free to travel around China. Everything is choreographed. Um, I mean, the best advice I ever had is, in a communist country, nothing happens to you by accident.
Right.
Well, of course, it does occasionally, but generally speaking, it's better to make the assumption that nothing happens by accident. So
Right. Yeah.
it's difficult to develop I would need time to develop a sort of policy package. But what I'm saying is it should be based on these absolutely clear-cut principles and that we should understand that China is now not just a competitive power, it's a hostile power.
In a word, and I feel like this is a good place to end for us. Do unto Xi Jinping as Xi Jinping would do unto you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely the same.
I'm going to make you a T-shirt, Richard, and when you come to Future in Review, which you are doing as a speaker this year, we'll give it to you on stage.
That's brilliant. Okay, we haven't discussed Putin, but we can save that for the future.
We'll save, yeah. So for those of you who are watching, Sir Richard Dearlove will be joining us at Future in Review 2024 as a speaker. We are so delighted to have him. We will be having further conversations about the state of the world, and if you have questions for him and you are attending, you will have a chance to ask him your own questions.
I'm going to put in a plug for my own podcast, which is called One
Okay,
Decision.
great.
One Decision. Yeah, it's called One Decision, and it's geopolitics, weekly program dropped. Lots of interesting people talking very serious geopolitics.
Wonderful, which we very much support. We'll put a link in our podcast description for you.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much for being
Berit,
here today.
It's great fun.
Great to see you as always.
Yeah, and a serious conversation between the two of us. I think, there are a lot of people out there who need to listen carefully.
I hope they do.